Greetings everyone, welcome to the newest episode of Listen to Your Head. I'm Andy, I'll be your host, and today our guest is Zoltán Kelemen, assistant professor at Corvinus University of Budapest, Department of International Relations. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our topic today is the theory of neomedievalism, its political narratives, and possible parts in today's conflicts. And I'll start with the first question. What drew you personally to study neomedievalism?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. The reason why I started studying neomedievalism was related to my PhD dissertation. I was focusing on the European Union and its democratic deficit, and as I was entering the first phases of the research, I understood that the definition of the European Union is something quite ambiguous. It's very difficult to point your finger on what the European Union is or where it is going. And what I found in the literature that most scholars disagree about how we could define the European Union. Some argued that the EU essentially is very far from what we could call a state in political science, and this was the only point on which they agreed. But when it comes to what it actually was or what it actually is, the points differed and diverged significantly. Some said that the EU essentially was something like a Bund. Some said that it was a transnational consociation. And they all came up with these weird neologisms, these new words created in order to promote their research mostly. And then I thought that the one thing that links all these ideas together was that despite the fact that they argue and agree that the EU is not a state, they all measure the EU against the concept of statehood. Some claim that it's a pre-state, some claim that it's a post-state. And those who argued that it was a pre-state, some sort of a conglomerate that could evolve towards statehood through long-term federalization, also said that it was in a pre-modern state, in a pre-modern form of existence. And a certain scholar from Oxford, Jan Zielonka, argued that the European Union essentially could be best thought of as a neo-medieval empire. And that caught my attention. I thought, it's an interesting idea, neo-medieval
so
empire.
So that surprised you?
That is what
Yeah.
that was what drew me into doing the research. And then I started reading a bit more about what neo-medievalism was, and it turned out that in international relations there is a fairly big group of scholars who claim that the current international order as a whole is neo-medieval.
Could you specify what is neo-medievalism? When we talk about neo-medievalism, what exactly do we mean by that?
It depends. If we look at neo-medievalism, just the word, it could mean many different things. So for instance, in the middle of the 20th century, neo-medievalism was thought of as a cultural concept. There's an Italian scholar whose name is Umberto Eco, and he argued that neo-medievalism means that currently we're living in an age in which the image is becoming more important than the word, the written word. So similarly to the Middle Ages, where a rose window, decoration was how people were informed, for instance, about the teachings of the church. Today we're also more informed through television. This was written in the 1970s, this piece of literature by Eco. And he thought that because of this, because of some of the structural similarities between our culture and the medieval culture, we could think that we are entering a phase of a neo-medieval world or a neo-medieval future. So one thing was this image-based culture that started to appear after the Second World War. A second thing was the role of English as a language. The English language, the way we use it as a second language mostly, in a very simple form, is something that has some similarity to medieval Latin, which was a language that was essentially extinct by the time medieval scholars were using it, but that was the language that everyone used while writing their treatises and their theories down. So in that sense, a simplified international lingua franca, which everybody's using, but not as their mother tongue, could bring us again closer to a type of culture that is somewhat neo-medieval. But from the 70s onwards, this idea was also transported to the field of international relations. And scholars like Arnold Wolfers or Hadley Bull claimed that in IR, we could think of and conceptualize of the international system as something that is not only state-based anymore. So the post-1945 international system, thanks to the appearance of international organizations, multinational companies, NGOs, etc., started to have actors different from the state. So it was not the name of the game of international relations was not only the state, as it was the case in the 19th century or in the Westphalian period. And therefore, similarly to the Middle Ages, you had actors all of a sudden above the state, within the state, and below the state, who were eroding or questioning the sovereignty of the states. In the Middle Ages, these forces above the kingdoms were the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, and below them you had religious orders, you had city-states, you had the feudal system, certain acts of territorial separatism, and all these questions the authority or the sovereignty of the kings. Today, these actors questioning or undermining the sovereignty of the states are the ones I mentioned: multinational companies, international organizations, NGOs, etc. So there's a structural similarity according to such theorists.
Okay, and reflecting on what you said, who do you think holds power in a neo-medieval world? You mentioned NGOs and the structural debate. Is it states, supranational institutions, or, like you mentioned, other actors such as NGOs?
It is difficult to tell, and that is the general...
It's not a definitive answer.
There's no definitive answer, and that causes most of the problems, according to those analysts who bring or try to find the connections between neo-medievalism and the concept of post-truth. Certain truths that we've had started to disappear. For instance, who is leading us? Many of the electorates of the world started noticing in the 21st century that no matter who they vote for, it's not actually the government that shapes the future of certain countries. There are economic realities that can defy the nicest promises of any politicians. And because of that, speculation started to appear since the early 2000s that, okay, if not our politicians, our elected politicians are the ones in charge of our lives and of the world, then who are? And of course, this uncertainty, the fact that we do not know exactly whether the locus of sovereignty still is with the states or with international organizations or multinational companies, we start to have certain conspiracy theories or other forms of speculation where people suspect Google, Facebook, the Bilderberg Group, George Soros, or whatever, the Illuminati behind certain world affairs and tendencies. So the fact that it's not clear anymore who are the exclusive actors of international relations and the exclusive subjects of international law, like it used to be in the case of the Westphalian world order, where it was just clearly the state, it's also questionable where our leaders are and who exactly our leaders are. Most likely, what we could understand or what we could claim is that we do not seem to have a single actor who has sovereignty. So this concept, the modern concept of indivisible sovereignty, seems to have evaporated over the last 25, 30 years for sure.
Okay. And you mentioned you focused on the European Union. And if so, in what ways is the European Union portrayed as either a civilizational project or maybe like a collapsing empire? And with this question, how do these narratives differ across like European regions? Maybe could you give us some concrete examples from Central or Eastern Europe, mentioning Hungary as well?
Well, this was quite a lot to ask. So first of all, in which ways the EU could be related to neo-medievalism? This was a question that I was looking at mostly in my doctoral work. And there I claimed, in line with certain scholars, that the reason why you could label the EU as a pre-modern entity or a neo-medieval entity is because if you look at it, it functions more like a medieval kingdom than a modern state. You have many different nation states in it, with many different languages. We don't have a demos or a common political backdrop culture, And as a consequence, if you try to conceptualize the functioning of the EU, you will not really find things like the separation of powers or liberal democracy at the level of the EU like you would in most of its member states. And the reason behind it is that for these, you would need a fairly mature, politically grown-up society. And in the EU, according to an Italian scholar called Gian Domenico Maione, we have a fairly primitive society. So while the member state societies are rather advanced when it comes to a common identity, at the level of the EU, it's much more primitive or pre-modern. So if you want to compare the European Union to something, some form of a state, that would be something, in my estimation, something like medieval France. Zielonka claims it could be comparable to the Holy Roman Empire. Well, these medieval formations usually had many different languages spoken in them. In the case of France, in Bretagne, the language spoken was completely different from the language spoken in Provence before absolutism and before the birth of the modern French literary language. And because of that, they did not have a common demos, just like we do not have one in the European Union. And if we look at the way the EU functions, if we just try to describe what we see, what we often notice is that instead of the separation of powers, which is a modern idea of Montesquieu, it's a functional understanding of power, we see more the so-called mixed constitutional approach of neo-Aristotelian thinkers of the Middle Ages or Aristoteles himself, which essentially is built around representation. The concept of the mixed constitution says that in a good regime, you have to have one who governs, a monarch. A regime should also have an aristocracy in it, the best, the crème de la crème of the society, who have a certain expertise and the wisdom with which they can govern. But some kind of a democratic representation is also needed. So according to this pre-modern definition of the ideal regime, you have to have a single ruler, a certain form of an aristocracy, and also democratic representation. And in the EU, we see something along these lines. The Commission represents the totality of the community, one, the entity as a whole. It's the representation of the whole thing, the representation of one. You have the Council, which represents the few, the 27 member states, in line with the aristocratic approach of the Middle Ages. And you have the representation of the many in the form of the European Parliament. So in this respect, just by looking at the functioning of the EU and also putting next to this functioning the fairly primitive form of the European demos, we could argue that the EU is a pre-modern form of a political unity, comparable to certain early modern or medieval actors like medieval French kingdom or the Holy Roman Empire. So in this way, we could start analyzing the EU through the lens of neomedievalism. This is one thing. But neomedievalism can also be helpful in understanding certain processes that are happening within the member states. So I'm sure that most of our viewers heard of the so-called concept of democratic backsliding. And democratic backsliding essentially underlines a certain phenomenon all around Europe where liberal democracy enters a phase of chaos or crisis. And this is particularly prevalent in East Central Europe. And according to the neo-medieval narrative, we could theorize about democratic backsliding as something that is a response to this transformation of the international system. We could argue that, in fact, in the early modern period, gradually through Enlightenment and the evolution of the 19th century and early 20th century, liberal democracy was born as a response to the collapse of the medieval world order, where the authority of the Pope and the Emperor was basically switched off through Reformation and then the 30 Years' War. And as a consequence, all power, without any checks, fell into the hands of the sovereign rulers, of the kings, who became, therefore, absolutistic rulers in most of the states of Europe. And enlightened intellectuals were interested in the question how we could limit the authority of these rulers, these absolutistic kings. And this is how they came to the conclusion of building checks and balances into the constitution, of introducing the form of the representation of the people. These were all aimed at limiting the seemingly exclusive authority or sovereignty of the king, because the external checks of the Pope and the Emperor ceased to exist. And now with this post-1945 new change, yet another big change of the international system, where you have exclusive checks on certain states in the form of international organizations and multinational companies, certain political leaders start to argue, if we are being limited from the outside, why would we need internal checks on our power? What do we need rule of law for? Why do we need the separation of powers? Why do we need a liberal form of democracy? We should make sure that in this period where we are constantly under siege by external forces, we gather the remaining fragments of our authority, of our sovereignty, in one hand, preferably in the hand of a strong leader. So in this sense, it's not only the functioning of the EU that you could understand or try to analyze through this concept of neomedievalism, but also the process of democratic backsliding in the member states. Of course, Hungary is an obvious example of that. But if we think of neo-medieval imagery, which I think was a part of the question, then we could definitely point our finger at certain cultural traditions or cultural phenomena of the recent past, and also on some political developments. If you just think of the fact, not only in Europe, but all around the Western world, the Middle Ages are becoming very popular in terms of popular culture, TV series, from the 1980s up to the present day, trying to tell a story through a medieval lens, through a medieval imagery, has been very popular, ranging from, Knight Rider, which is a very chivalric idea at its core, to the Game of Thrones. But also in political terms, if you look at Hungary, over the last few years, our government introduced certain phrases which resonate or which remind us of the glorious past of the Hungarian Middle Ages, like Ispán or Vármegye. These are fairly pre-modern concepts if you think of just symbols and labels on certain administrative functions. And in this respect, we could also link the concept of neo-medievalism to neo-feudalism, because when it comes to certain political developments in East Central Europe, there is significant literature which analyzes the hierarchies of power introduced in many of these countries through the concept of neo-feudalism. And Alispán, Főispán, Vármegye, these phrases resonate pretty well with such understandings of power.
Thank you. And what do you think? How does now neo-medievalism help us understand modern conflicts, especially those involving non-state actors?
It can be useful. For instance, now with a scholar from another university, I'm working on an article which is looking at mercenaries in the Middle Ages, in the 30 Years' War, and currently. And in this paper, we argue that mercenaries and the way they had to cooperate or coexist with the local population share certain similarities with those mercenaries who lived in previous times, in the pre-Westphalian period, during the 30 Years' War, or during the 100 Years' War in the Middle Ages. So in this respect, the rise of private international violence, which was already claimed by Hadley Bull as one of the symptoms of a neo-medieval world order, is definitely one of those aspects that are worth looking at. And in this sense, of course, we could also be critical. Some pieces of literature argue that you cannot compare today's mercenaries with the mercenaries of the past because the context is very different. So in the name of historicity, certain scholars like Malte Riemann, for instance, argue that we do not exactly understand what counted as foreign in the Middle Ages, where you had overlapping authorities and realms of power that are very difficult to understand through our modern concepts. It's also difficult to, some claim it's difficult to think of medieval mercenaries as people who had an idea or could understand self-interest. In their analysis, self-interest is a modern concept, and therefore thinking of the medieval mercenary as someone that could be compared to today's mercenaries is a historical fallacy that we should avoid. However, I still think that basic concepts like foreignness, inside or outside, concepts like pecuniary or financial self-interest are concepts that have been present everywhere. In the 9th century, for instance, when Hungarians arrived at the Carpathian Basin, they were used by certain Carolingian kings as mercenaries. And we can safely assume that these Hungarians, who had a very different type of warfare, who spoke a language that no one up to that point heard in Europe, could or were labeled at the time as foreigners, as people who are alien to the European way of life and European culture. And because of that, I think that in just this one respect, it's fairly easy to use neomedievalism as a theoretical framework to understand this privatization of international violence. With the rise of private military companies, with the rise of troops like the Wagner Group, it's getting more important to understand certain patterns that exist throughout history, and neomedievalism is a toolkit or a theoretical framework with which we can do just that.
As we look into the future, is the world really moving toward a genuine medieval or neo-medieval order, or is it mainly just a metaphor that we can parallel to our everyday life?
It depends on what we call a neo-medieval order, so how we define it. If the question is, are we going back to something very similar as the Middle Ages on a daily basis, my answer would be clearly no, because the Middle Ages was something fundamentally different of what we are experiencing. I had the chance to talk to many medieval historians. I was studying medieval history in a university level. I was doing an MA degree in it, and whichever professor I talked to, they always said that they would not like to live in the Middle Ages, no matter how romantic it seems.
Not surprising.
Because of the extremely different way and quality of life that those people had in Europe hundreds of years ago and what we have. So in this respect, I would not argue that we are going towards a medieval future. But the question is how we define neo-medieval order. If we say that we are going to have more chaos on the international stage, less rules than in the Westphalian order or in the international system which was created right after 1945, I think it is safe to assume that we are going to enter such a phase. And it's also important to emphasize that already now we share certain characteristics with the medieval political imagination. So, for instance, if you think of the concept of apocalypticism, the idea that we think of the world as of something that is on the brink of collapse or disappearance on both sides of the political spectrum. On the right wing, people argue for a cultural apocalypticism. On the left wing, people argue for a green or a climate apocalypticism or an apocalypse. Both of these realms of power, both of these spectrums, of both of these sides of the political spectrum. And in this respect, I think it is easy to argue that already now the idea that the world is coming to an end is a popular one. And it was also very popular in the Middle Ages. Especially around the year 1000, everybody was waiting for the end of the world. And since the world did not come to an end in the year 1000, people thought, okay, it is going to happen in 1033, on the 1000th anniversary of the death of Jesus Christ. And therefore people were preparing for some form of an apocalypse. And that, what humanity experienced 1,000 years ago, in around the year 1000 is comparable or similar to this general doomsday feel that we tend to experience if we just scroll the news. So in this sense, I wouldn't even argue that we are going to live in a neo-medieval future, but that in terms of the way we perceive our future as something rather bleak and something pretty maybe hopeless even, could be compared in some respects to the medieval imagination of the future. So in this respect, it's not only the future that could be thought of as neo-medieval, but also the present. However, this does not mean that we will see the second coming of the Middle Ages in any form. And it's also difficult, even if we would argue that the Middle Ages is coming back, it's difficult to say which Middle Ages. The Middle Ages started with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, and it ended sometime in the 15th century, either with the fall of the Byzantine Empire or with the discovery of America, the American continent. So in this respect, we can think of various centuries that are completely different compared to each other. So in the early medieval period, there was a sense of collapse. The great Roman Empire and the beauties of antiquity disappeared, while we could also argue that essentially the Middle Ages is a series of renaissances. The Carolingian Renaissance, the Ottonian Renaissance around the year 1000, you had the 12th century Renaissance, and then of course the Great Renaissance. So these were fairly beautiful periods of European history, of course not unproblematic, but there was a certain level of scientific development, a certain level of aesthetic revolution, and even Gothic architecture or Romanesque architecture are connected to the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages is not bad, dark, or backward in itself. I think that most medievalists, medieval historians try to fight against this very generalized view of the Middle Ages where everything is dark. We could say that the 10th century was a dark one, where Europe was under siege by certain external forces, but there was also internal chaos. That's the time when the Vikings were attacking from the north, when the Saracens were attacking from the south, and the Hungarians also arrived to Europe. So even by contemporaries, the 10th century was labeled as the saeculum obscurum, the dark century, but that does not apply to the whole of the Middle Ages. And if it's a metaphor, well, in many respects, of course it is, because our daily experience is very different from what medieval people experienced.
Yes. And what do you think? What might governments look like if neo-medieval tendencies continue to grow?
I think it will be much more difficult to govern a country if such neo-medieval tendencies start to grow, especially a smaller country or even a mid-sized country, the size of an average European country, because if we have these external forces who are way more powerful and who are difficult to control, it is not going to be easy to make any nice campaign promises and then deliver them. So in this respect, more chaos, more uncertainty could follow as a consequence of this change, of this remedievalization of the world. But we could also claim, as I said, that sovereignism, the idea that we need strong leaders, is also a consequence of this more chaos. So in times of uncertainty, in times of overlapping realms of power and multiple loyalties, people often try to cling on to a certain leader who can sell himself or herself as strong. So neo-medievalism, or the idea of this neo-medieval international system, could be one of the reasons why the rise of strongmen seemed like a force of nature in the 2010s. In case we do not know where power is, who has power, in case we do not know where the world is headed, if the old ideologies of liberalism, conservatism, socialism all fail, and we don't have anything instead of that other than apocalypticism, then people often feel that they should at least have a very decided and a strong leader. So many of those factors that we link, or symptoms of neo-medievalism, that we could also link to the concept of post-truth, this idea that we do not exactly know where truth is anymore, who are our leaders, where is the world headed, which ideology is right, which is wrong. In these times, the only factor that people see as a solution to the problems is often the strong leader.
Thank you again for accepting our invitations and joining us for this educative conversation. And also thank you for your attention, and join us for our next episode.